Hello and welcome to Chapter 10. In this chapter, we cover several things that actually could be their own courses, so it's a little bit longer. I'll try not to bore you too much. The material is upsetting, so just be aware of some of the things that we're talking about. I try to keep it very fact based, so at least the lecture part. Um, all right, so here we go. I always like starting off with a nice little quote that kind of tries to keep some things in perspective, right? Child abuse. About 3.3 million children were abused. This is 2010. My updated one should be shortly coming. Of those, close to a million were substantiated. Some of the stats, if you remember ACEs, and how many ACEs it takes, one of the things we know is that the majority of sexual abuse victims knew their perpetrator. Many were family. Here's an interesting thing to cite as well. When you start looking at prison populations, about a third of women in prison were abused as children, and more than half of people in AODA and drug rehab were abused or neglected as children. So it's important that regardless of what branch or field of human services you're going into, this is something that will be in the backgrounds of a number of the clients that you're working with. 30% of abused and neglected children will grow up to do the same, which, just to put the silver lining on this, 70% won't. And I think that's important to keep in mind. 80% of 21-year-olds who were abused as children meet the criteria for at least one psychological disorder, which is not a surprise considering the ACEs stuff that we read. Some of the types of child abuse: there's physical abuse, and I'll let you read the definition for yourself here. Uh, Sexual abuse, and there can be two different interventions here. If it's within the family, um, actually, I would, if you're not a human services worker, there are two approaches to this. As a human services worker, report either to Child Protective Services. Uh, you could, if it's the way I look at this is if it's an immediate concern, like the perp is in the house, um, maybe a call to 911 as well. There's also neglect, which is actually the biggest form of child abuse, and overall it does have a lot more negative outcomes, which is kind of interesting too if you look at the research in terms of what neglect does to people over the long haul. As well as emotional abuse, which is the most difficult to prove and also the most prevalent. The reason it's the most difficult to prove is that, with physical abuse, you can look at an x-ray or a picture. With sexual abuse, there can be some physical damage um, or some at least physical signs, but with emotional abuse, you're not going to see that sort of stuff. Some signs of abuse: child arrives early, leaves late, doesn't want to go home. Maybe they're overly compliant. Maybe they're very hyperactive. In fact, a lot of the kids that I had worked with who'd been exposed to domestic violence or abuse at home or even in their environment, in their neighborhood, initially were seen as ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. But there are other things going on as well. They can have unexplained injuries, burns, bruises, or the stories behind how they got the injury is unclear. They may complain about, they may articulate the abuse. They may articulate. Actually, one of the big red flags is, and I, not to typecast anyone, but when there's a single mom with a live-in boyfriend. Unfortunately, that's a very big red flag that there might be something going on in the home. Um, Difficulties going to the bathroom. That might be physical or related to trauma or both. They may dress inappropriately for weather. That may be a sign of neglect or abuse. They may be covering up marks. If their clothing is tattered or too small, if they're dirty, if they're unkempt, if lice is just rampant and it's never taken care of, if they are thin, emaciated, if they're not meeting the developmental milestones on time, if they're fearful of other children and adults, they may have an exaggerated, what we call a startle response, like a loud noise or anything like that, very jumpy. Um, if they've been given inappropriate food, drink, or drugs, they may also have poor muscle tone, vomiting, or ocular hemorrhaging, where their eyes are like extremely bloodshot, bleeding looking, and that's a sign of shaken baby syndrome. Signs of abusive parents. They show little concern for their child's problem. They take an unusual amount of time to seek health care. They don't explain an injury very well. They might give different explanations for the same injury. They complain about problems that don't really seem to pertain to what the problem at hand is, or they may blame someone else. They may not share information. You might find a history of abuse, drug abuse, substance use. They don't have any friends or relatives to provide support or respite. They can be very strict disciplinarians. If there's a history of abuse when they were children, if they doctor shop a lot, if they go to a lot of different doctors, hoping nobody's really like comparing notes, if they tend to come across as antagonistic and hostile. About 15 to 25% of women and 5 to 15% of men were sexually abused as children. 30% of perpetrators are relatives. 60% are friends of family, babysitters, or neighbors, and 10% are strangers. Men most often commit sexual abuse on children. There are some presumptive behaviors indicating sexual abuse, things that we would assume sexual abuse is happening. For example, if the child makes an outcry, don't assume it's not sexual abuse. Teen pregnancy, if they have a venereal disease, if there's genital bruising or other injuries. Shaken baby syndrome or infant whiplash syndrome can be life threatening, it can be a serious injury, and oftentimes have long term consequences as a result of brain damage or other physical damage. Child abuse accommodation syndrome. This is oftentimes when a parent, the non-abusing parent, um, does not make an outcry or allows for the abuse to happen. There may be secrecy. They may accommodate the abuse. They may not want to be in the next room. They may go to a different room. Um, and they may not discuss the information or keep certain information away from people who are investigating. In this unit, we'll review the mandated reporting laws. I have a link to that. This first, really, we first started looking at this in I think it was like in the 50s and 60s, when we were looking at the battered child is actually the name of I think the first article that came out about children being abused. And it wasn't until the 70s when I was 4. Oh my God, and I'm an old man. When I was 4, which doesn't seem that long ago to me, where we actually had a federal law, the Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, which created nationwide reporting, where that's when DCFS, each state, was responsible for developing their own child protective services and interventions to prevent child abuse. So, some of the interventions, of course, as a mandated reporter, you don't have to have proof of abuse. All you have to have is a suspicion. That's really the bottom line. And let DCFS determine if there's proof or not. Keep that out of your hands and let the state do the investigation. Um, the child may not come out and confess it, or the adult even, because if the adult is financially or emotionally dependent on the abuser, they're not going to jeopardize those things necessarily. They may blame themselves. Um, the abuser may have threatened the child. The child may not think anyone's going to listen to them, or they may not have the words to articulate what exactly happened. Um, I think we've also talked about the idea of repression, um, and part of that might be about resilience, but part of that might have to do exactly with PTSD and interference in the hippocampus. Provide a safe atmosphere. That is the number one key here. Regardless of what else you do, everything is couched in safety. Assure that they will be protected, use some reframes that parents need guidance and help. Not that they're bad people, because honestly, there are plenty of children who've been abused who love their parents. And so when you start talking about their parents being bad people or anything like that, you're not going to get to the point where the child's going to feel safe with you either. Educate them about not being alone in this. Some other interventions that are helpful for kids in particular: play therapy, family therapy, and group therapy. Group therapy is good, I think, in particular for older kids and teenagers, or even on the side of the battered parent, being involved in group counseling about addressing their behaviors. Elder abuse can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be financial. It can happen in long term facilities, and now most states have mandatory reporting laws. Each state provides its own definitions of abuse and neglect based on minimum standards set by federal law. This is an example from the Illinois Department on Aging, um, 2008, so a little old. I got to update this too. There were over 10,000 reported cases of abuse. Almost 1 in 4 victims is over the age of 86. The most frequent report was financial, and second was emotional. And the vast majority were children of the adult who is being abused. Many older adults who live at home are at risk for abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation by family members and others who are close to them. It's estimated that over 76,000 people over the age of 60 in Illinois are elder abuse victims, yet only 10,000 victims are reported to the Elder Abuse and Neglect Program annually. Victims of abuse are often isolated. They may be afraid or unable to seek help for themselves. In many cases, the only person outside the family who sees the victim is a healthcare professional or a home care provider, might be a financial institution or some other helping professional. We do know that the vast majority were female. Half of the abusers were male, and 40% of victims lived with their abusers. A third were functionally impaired, which also makes it difficult for them to access the phone or to make an outcry. Signs of abuse, elderly abuse, include bruises, pressure marks, abrasions, burns, etc., etc., the physical symptoms that you can see. Unexplained withdrawal from normal activities, sudden change in alertness, bruising around genitalia, sudden changes in financial situations as well. There can also be bed sores, poor hygiene, unattended medical needs, unusual weight loss. They can have frequent arguments between caregiver and the adult. Oftentimes the victim is silent about what is happening because it's, oftentimes a family member, so why speak out about it, right? Some of the risk factors: if the victim has dementia or Alzheimer's, if they're socially isolated, or if they live with a caregiver, if the caregiver has a history of domestic violence. Oftentimes people who suffer from Alzheimer's or dementia, they are not good reporters, and because of this, they're more vulnerable to abuse and neglect. Oops, went too far. Some of the interventions include a multidisciplinary team approach. That means you're talking to nurses and doctors, other folks who can address physiological issues, maybe neurologists. Of course, protect and heal the damage, get them involved in support groups. They may need financial planning and a guardian. They may need transportation, and also assistance around how to be more assertive, more of what we call the empowerment approach. Intimate partner abuse or domestic violence. There has been a long history of tolerance of abuse of women, and this isn't. There are cultural aspects to this too, right? Not just in the U.S., but if you look abroad, there are countries where abusing your spouse, assaulting your wife in particular, is still legal. There have been recent changes in law that require police to repress charges. I think they call them no drop policies where the state cannot drop charges that have been brought to them, even if the victim decides that they don't want to press charges. It was not until the 1870s that courts in the United States stopped recognizing the common law principle that a husband had the right to, and this is a quote, physically chastise an errant wife. In the UK, the United Kingdom, the traditional right of a husband to inflict moderate corporal punishment on his wife in order to keep her, quote, within the bounds of duty was removed in 1891. In the more recent past, until 1976, marital rape was legal in every state in the United States. Some myths. There are cultural elements to this too, like what language do they speak? There may be some fear of deportation, economic self sufficiency, racism, and also bringing shame upon the family name. So there are cultural aspects to this too. Some of the myths are that it only happens to minorities and poor people. Um, I knew one of my colleagues in school did some research on what would you call it, a higher end socioeconomic abuse. Um, Wealthy people, where the men would abuse the women, and the women oftentimes would not leave in large part because of their financial dependence, and so they'd keep things quiet. Some of the myths are that women are masochistic and achieve some sort of satisfaction over this. That the battered woman has a dependent personality disorder. Sometimes you'll see this, that they get, in the past especially, that women would get diagnosed with like these personality disorders for staying with these men who abuse them, which we now look back as pretty silly. Battering is caused by alcohol and drug abuse. It does not require those things. They can be involved, but is not required, as well as mental illness. Not required, can be involved, but again, not required. I think there is this one persistent sort of universal cultural theme is that men assert power over women, and that's why men often get a pass to do this, and that's why laws have been slow to change because men have typically been in charge of legislation. Some cultural factors, and again, you can read through this in the text. May have to do with regards to Latinos, may have to do with isolation as a result of not speaking English. They may feel disconnected from medical care providers. There may be fear, if this is an issue, of being deported if they report. They may be unaware of resources. They may be financially dependent because of their employment history. Also, there are traditions of machismo, which is the um, male being in charge and tough and uh, the disciplinarian of the house. That the woman needs to sacrifice herself for the sake of the family, that sort of stuff. Other cultural factors: African Americans may feel isolated from outside the community, may not want to betray their own race and further racism, mistrust of the legal system generally and healthcare providers. There might be a lack of economic self sufficiency, and they may feel need to support African American males and not to expose them to any more stressors from a racist society. Cultural factors for Asian Americans, again, isolated, fear of bringing shame to the family name, being ostracized from their own community. There might be language issues. They might be unaware of the basic laws or civil rights. There may be a lack of resources in their community, as well as the gender inequality issue, which comes across in a number of cultures where men are seen as superior. Prevalence issues: about 3/4 of women report rape or assault was perpetrated by a current or former husband or partner. A quarter of women stated they had been raped or assaulted by a current or former spouse or partner. It is a leading cause of injury for American women ages 15 to 44. 1 in 4 women, 25% of women, will be assaulted by a domestic partner. So, why do women stay? A lot of reasons. They're afraid of being killed. They don't want to leave the pets. They don't want their children to get hurt. The family might be putting pressure on her to stay and trying to work through it. There might be religious beliefs connected to this, that you don't divorce or leave your spouse, which is also connected to some pro family values. They may be, again, economically dependent, no resources, or they may be very focused on children needing their father, of course. Other reasons, no support from their family. Maybe internally they just hope that he'll change. They might believe it's their own fault, like if they didn't do certain things, it wouldn't happen. And that might not just be their own internal dialogue. They may have been told that a number of times. They may see no other option. They might feel insecure and unable to take care of themselves. The battering cycle, and I've got a link to this as well. Uh, so we'll start with the acute explosion where the batterer is assaulting the victim. The victim's response is that they try to protect themselves. Maybe they'll call the police. They try to calm the batterer. Maybe they try to leave. Maybe they fight back. Over time, then there's a honeymoon. The batterer begs for forgiveness, goes to counseling, sends flowers. I'll never do that again. The victim response is to agree to stay. They take them back. They attempt to stop legal proceedings. They start to feel happy and cared for. And then the tension building begins again, where the batterer becomes moody, nitpicking, isolates them, withdraws affection. Maybe they get back into their drinking or drug use. The victim response is to attempt to calm them, to nurture them, maybe to isolate themselves, to keep the kids quiet, to withdraw, to reason with the batterer. Battered woman syndrome. These are PTSD symptoms, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are more in class. We've talked a little bit about what PTSD does with regards to the brain, and when we're looking at the ACEs study, there's this sense of learned helplessness. Oh, there's nothing I can do anyway. I tried to do this, tried to get assistance before, and it didn't work out. There can also be self-destructive coping responses to violence. There can be, blaming yourself, drinking, drug use, and then, of course, then they blame themselves for engaging in that behavior as well. Interventions really require an empowerment approach, a supportive approach, a lot of reframing so that they can challenge some of those cognitive distortions. Let them know that help is available, give them specific information about resources, educate, educate, educate. Document the battering with accurate medical records. Make sure you acknowledge the experience, validate their feelings, respect their right to make their own decisions. Again, everything is couched in terms of safety, just so that you are aware too, if there is domestic violence in the home and there's a child involved, that is automatically a DCFS call. It is considered child abuse for a child to be living in a home where there is domestic violence occurring. So be aware of that as well. The batterer may require psychoeducational interventions, but more than that, it's not just educating that will resolve things. Groups, mandated counseling, meaning via the courts, so that there is sort of like some sort of monitoring. You may even see things like restraining orders, AA, NA, that sort of stuff that focus on being control of impulses. Some of the behaviors that they use to maintain power and control have to do with intimidating the victim, isolating them, emotionally and economically abusing them. They may sexually abuse them. They may use children, put children in the middle of everything. Well, you wouldn't leave me. You're not going to leave these children. Or they may even say, you think they may even make threats about the children to the victim if they leave. Of course, using their male privilege, asserting themselves, no one's going to believe you, as well as physical abuse. That's the end of this uplifting chapter.